Alright guys, Tyler down here at Emerald City Guitars. As you can see, we're back in the shop today, and today we're going to talk a little bit about pickups, very specifically the PAF humbucker. Now I think it's pretty fair to say that the PAF is the most iconic guitar pickup of all time. It has been heard on literally hundreds of the most historically important and influential records made since the 50s. It's pretty single-handedly spawned this huge boutique pickup market whose sole goal is to replicate its sound exactly. And at the time of this video, the right set of PAFs can sell for as much as $10,000, maybe more. It's just a huge, crazy market. It's shrouded in mystery, but the tone is there and we love it so much. So in this quick little video, I'm going to kind of give you a cursory rundown of what a PAF is, a little bit of history about them, and how they differ from our modern run-of-the-mill humbuckers. So the PAF is pretty widely credited as the first humbucking guitar pickup. This isn't the case at all. In fact, the whole idea of having reverse wound coils with reverse polarity magnets to cancel hum, it goes back to the 19-teens. It was very commonplace at that point. It was used widely in tape recorder heads, the pickups in those heads, to cancel hum, as well as in transformers and choke coils, and it was not a new idea at the time. So humbucking pickups actually found their way into guitars as early as the 1920s, but for the same reasons that single coil pickups of the same era didn't really take off, the humbuckers didn't as well. The magnets just weren't strong enough to produce a really strong signal, and in conjunction with that, the amplifiers weren't loud enough to make it practical in a band setting. So throughout the 20s and 30s, they definitely got put to the side. So around roll the 1940s and 50s. Now, at this point, amps have gotten a lot bigger, a lot louder, and recording technology had advanced to a point where it was very, very hi-fi. So the idea of a noise-reducing or noise-canceling humbucking pickup was seeming more and more and more appealing. And by 1955, Gibson thought they should get on board. So in 1955, Gibson asked one of its engineers, a man named Seth Lover, to design a new pickup for them. So at this point in his career, Seth was primarily an amp designer. In fact, he designed every circuit that Gibson released since 1952. He'd also actually designed the staple Alnico 5 P90 pickup, so he had experience with pickups. And there's actually rumor he designed the Flying V guitar as well. But in 1955, they wanted a brand new pickup with a cool new feature, basically that the sales team could sell. So Seth decided that this new feature should be the humbucking coil. And he filed for his patent in 1955. Of course, it wasn't granted until 1959, but Gibson rolled out these brand new pickups on their 1957 models. So we'd first see these new pickups in 1957, and the PAF specifically would continue well into the 60s. So what makes these PAFs so different? How do they differ from our modern PAF copies? Well, the truth is that they differ pretty fundamentally in virtually every component of the humbucker from our modern day equivalents. So let's go one by one and kind of talk about these specific components and how they differ. So let's start with the covers. So original PAF covers are made of German nickel silver that are plated in pure nickel. Now these covers themselves are very, very thin and pretty transparent tonally. So these vintage covers look great and they sound great, but they are a little bit difficult to manufacture. There's a lot of surface prep work that has to go in before the nickel plating. Now, most modern reproductions are also German silver, which is good. They're also nickel plated, which is good. However, they're generally much thicker, and there's a little bit of difference in the plating process. Rather than plating pure nickel right onto the German nickel silver, they do an intermediary coat of copper. Now this copper helps the adhesion of the pure nickel coat, which is good. It reduces the prep work you have to do on the base metal itself, so it's much quicker to manufacture. The only issue is, as we know, copper is very conductive and has very low resistance. So even a very thin layer, like the plating on these modern humbucker covers, is going to cut down on some highs, and they're not going to quite sound the same as their vintage equivalent. So let's talk about the magnets. Typically PAF magnets were Alnico 5, many times Alnico 2 in the neck, sometimes Alnico 4 in the bridge, sometimes a combination of all of them. They used a lot of different magnets with a lot of different compositions. Luckily, virtually all of these magnet compositions are still available today and are reproduced in huge, huge numbers. However, back in the 50s when Gibson was buying their magnets, they weren't doing so right off the shelf like we would today. They worked very, very closely directly with the manufacturers to get magnets that had very specific heat treating specs and other magnetic properties that they needed for their pickups. So these very particular magnets can be recreated today. In fact, they are by a very limited number of US manufacturers. However, the vast majority of humbucker magnets nowadays are coming from overseas. And overseas, they either don't have the technical data that they need to replicate these vintage style magnets, or they simply don't have the profit motive to do something like that. Not that many people can tell the difference, so unfortunately most modern humbuckers will have import magnets that have specs straight off the shelf. One more thing to mention really quick about the magnets is the manner by which they were magnetized. Back in the day at Gibson, they were magnetized in big groups, kind of a bar or a block. And when you magnetize magnets in this manner, it's very easy not to fully saturate them, not to fully charge the magnets. Now, when this is the case, they also tend to be less stable over their lifetime. So not only were they less consistent from the factory, but as time goes on, they drifted less predictably as well. So not only were they less consistent from the factory, but they're way more prone to drift over time. So let's talk about the coil wire for a little bit. The original PAFs were wound with right around 10,000 turns of 42 gauge plain enamel magnet wire. This is something that is well known. It's still an industry standard today. More often than not, you'll see poly-coated or form bar wire, but plain enamel is still easy enough to get. The big difference between old wire and new wire is that the old wire was drawn to much looser tolerances than it is today. And what that means was there's a lot more variation in the thickness of this old wire. How much capacitance per foot was in this old wire, which when you're turning 10,000 times around this bobbin, a little difference in thickness can make a big difference in tone. And that's really the main difference between old wire and new wire. All right, so let's talk about the bobbins and the bobbin material. So the original PAF bobbins are made from something called butyrate, which is a cellulose-based plastic that's made with butyric acid. Now, butyric acid happens to be the same chemical in human vomit that makes it smell so distinct and horrifying. So depending on how much these bobbins off-gas, if the covers are off or not, and a number of factors, you can oftentimes smell an original PAF. It is very distinct. You'll recognize it immediately. Now, most modern pickups are going to use either nylon or an ABS bobbin, which of course just smell like regular plastic. They do have some different properties though, as far as the density and things like that, that in an unpotted pickup can affect the resonance and therefore the tone of a pickup. One quick thing to mention that the new pickups don't get quite right most of the time is that while vintage PAF bobbins were identical on the outside, the internal dimensions weren't quite the same to each other. One of the bobbins was slightly bigger on the inside, meaning that that coil would stack a little bit quicker and might not have quite as many turns as the other bobbin. Now, of course, this affects the hum canceling properties as well as the tone. So most modern pickups will have the identical bobbins inside and out on both sides of the pickup, which it's a little difference, but it's probably worth noting. So we already talked about the magnets. Let's talk a little bit about the pole pieces and the slugs. Now, these pole screws, they've always been the same, about 3/4 long, nickel-plated steel, these Philister head screws. Now, the only real difference between the old ones and the new ones is the carbon content. And when you're transmitting magnetism from the magnet up towards the string, carbon content actually is directly correlated with treble response. Now, the big difference between the old screws and the new screws is that consistently the old screws had a much lower carbon content, which means they'll be a little bit softer, not so much attack on the high end. So similar to these screws, the slugs are also nickel-plated steel. The good news about those is that the composition has stayed pretty consistent. They're very standardized, and so the new ones are going to be pretty much the same as the old ones, which is good for us. So the last thing I want to address is a big misconception that I hear about a lot from more people than you'd think. The fact is there is no such thing as a hand-wound PAF. There was never a hand-wound PAF as long as they were being made. They were all, 100% of them, wound on machines. And this is hard for people to wrap their head around. They don't like it. They see hand-wound, they think mojo. They don't think machine winding is gonna produce a good sounding pickup, but they did a lot. Now, Gibson used a number of different winding machines from different manufacturers, and they all kind of had their own little flavor, but all of them had very accurate manual counters. All of them had very accurate automatic traverse. There was no guiding of the wire. All the wire was tensioned by the machine. Literally, most of them had auto stop. So you could put the bobbins on, flip it on, and then walk away, not even watch the pickup being wound. This is a very consistent way to make great pickups. However, it's pretty far from hand wound. So as I mentioned, each one of these winding machines kind of had their own personality, their own winding, layering patterns that makes one to the next a little bit distinct, kind of gives it their own flavor, but for the most part, the coils are one of the most consistent pieces of the pickup. And that's tough for people to believe, but it's true. All right, so when we lay it all out like that on paper, it sounds like there are some huge differences. However, the good news for us as players is that there are a huge number of awesome boutique pickup manufacturers out there right now who are just as detail-oriented as we are and are working very hard and making really, really, really good PAF replicas. Even a lot of these manufacturers who don't necessarily nail all the tiny details are still making awesome sounding pickups. So as far as modern PAF pickups go, some of my personal favorites are the Lawler Imperials, a tried and true, we love Lawler down here. Mojo also makes a very, very good PAF. Even the Duncan Antiquities for the price range are a very, very good PAF style pickup. If I absolutely had to pick my favorite PAF copy at any price point, it would definitely be the DT102s by Throwback. John over there at Throwback is so detail oriented. He's just so nerded out on the tiny, tiny details and has done what appears to be everything he possibly can do to get every detail exactly right. And the result is just awesome. Every set I've ever heard of these pickups just blow me away. And so they are a little bit pricey, but those are the ones that I'd recommend if you have to get as close as you possibly can to that PAF tone. I have no affiliation with them or any other company, by the way. I just really love the way they do business and I love their product. So that's about it. If you have any questions, observations, comments on your favorite PAF pickups, just put them down in the comments. I'll do what I can to get back to you. Thanks for watching. Again, this is Tyler down at Emerald City Guitars. We'll see you next time.